album, Van Halen II. So we did a bio on Van Halen when we did Van Halen 1, so you can check the archives for that. There wasn't a lot that went on in Van Halen between Van Halen 1 and 2, besides the fact that Van Halen 1 sold extremely well and they toured quite a bit. Now, that's all relative. There's a lot that happens in everyone's life in between. But this one is often compared to how Boston, right, did the debut album and then quickly released their second album shortly after this one. And there's a lot of overlap between that one and the first one because some of the material was the same and they just spread it out. Van Halen 1 and Van Halen 2 is a little bit of the same. It's about about a year and a half in between the release of these, and they just toured relentlessly off the first album in between that time. So that's probably the big thing that's going on at that point. And, I can add a little bit of context when we talk about it, but let's just go right into the review, Josh. Van Halen 2. I would imagine you were familiar with this one before talk about this.
Yes, very. I mean, you're the one that basically introduced me to Van Halen. So I've listened to all of these David Lee Roth albums, multiple times over and over, sometimes just on shuffle. So I forget what tracks are on what albums sometimes. But it's for me like there's no competing and comparing Eddie Van Halen and David Lee Roth. They're the one, and I don't want to sideline the other members of the band. They're just as important and good in Van Halen, but for me they're kind of like the top. They're the tops in terms of like what you can bring and what a rock band should
this
have.
Form of music. They're the
Yes.
highest evolution of the art. Yes.
Yeah, they are the peak in terms of what I want from rock and roll, and really kind of like what going forward, like what is important to me in terms of rock and roll, in terms of a good front man and virtuosic guitar playing. And this basically, for such a short turnaround time, this really continues Van Halen 1. I love Van Halen 1, and I love this album. This may be a slight step down in compared to the first one, but there are so many strong songs on this album, and it just continues to impress me and remind me of why I love the band. You have Jump on the first album, and you have Dance the Night Away on this one, which is a super strong, catchy song. I love, there's so many kind of like little things on this album that I like. Somebody Get Me a Doctor, I love that song. Bottoms Up, I love that song. Again, Spanish Fly is kind of like this interlude type song that demonstrates Eddie Van Halen's guitar. I always love listening to that, and it just ends, there's so many strong songs. I'm just like, being effusive about this, but DOA, I love the 8th track, and then just capping it off with Beautiful Girls, which is another kind of sing-along anthem, which I love. And, David Lee Roth always has his kind of little verbal additions to the song,
exaltations.
Yeah. His onomatopoeia, I guess you could say. That's which I love. And Michael Anthony and Alex are also, the rhythm section, as we've said, is always top notch as well on this, and I have no complaints. I mean, if I guess since we've talked about 84, the synth is not in play yet, so this is that's different from when we talked about that album, which comes later, and this is more in line with the first album. But I love it, and highest marks that you can get from me on this.
Well, in a funny thing in terms of through line, in the earlier one we talked about Serge Gainsbourg's connection to Francois Hardy. There's obviously a connection of Gene Simmons to Van Halen as well. Are you familiar with that story?
No, I'm not.
So Gene Simmons sees Kiss in the summer of '76 and is impressed.
Wait,
And
Gene
actually,
Simmons sees Kiss or
correct. Gene
okay?
Simmons sees Van Halen
Oh, sees
before
Van
Van Halen
Halen.
went. Yep.
Okay, got
He's
it.
impressed, and he actually produces a 29 track demo tape called Zero, which has surfaced as things always do, right at this in LA. And he's like, I think, yeah, you're gonna be huge. But he suggests they change their name to Daddy Longlegs, which I found extremely funny.
Yeah.
But he's really pushing it, but he needs people to juice it, and Kiss's management did not think that Van Halen had a chance of making it and turned him down. And so instead, I think it's Van Morrison's lead guitarist, kind of recommends them to Ted Templeman, and they sort of pass it around, and it's not till Warner Brothers sees them that they go. It's just amazing to me that you could hear what became this album and Van Halen 1 on a
Yeah.
track and not be like, we've got something here. Like, they're just like, oh, I don't know. And the reason I bring that up is because a lot of the things on that Zero demo, which you can look up online, it's actually a very interesting listen. It's the stuff of those albums plus some other covers. And, like every Van Halen album, there's a cover on this one. In this case, it's You're No Good. The Linda Ronstadt song is on there as a cover. And yeah, this one, it's just, some would say it's a repeat of, you often hear this say it's a lesser version of one, but I don't think so. I think it sounds similar, but I think it's more playful, I'd say. It's a little bit more Dave built into it, with songs like Somebody Get Me a Doctor, which is high camp, but also it's got this great riff on it. Spanish Fly is another song that's a little bit there. Beautiful Girls is a Dave vehicle where he's sort of going into that crooning style that he loves so much with like a jaunty sort of beach sound. Beautiful Girls sounds like a beach song. In fact, my friends and I growing up, a couple of us who loved Van Halen, whenever we would cross the bridge into the shore where we were from, that would be one of the songs that we would put on
Nice.
to indicate that we were officially at the beach, was Beautiful Girls, because it just fit perfectly. Josh mentioned DOA, which is another song I love that has that wicked guitar riff by Eddie Van Halen just pulsating through the song. Dance the Night Away, I believe also might be a cover if I remember correctly. I'll have to check on that, but it's got the hallmark Michael Anthony backing vocals, which are also all over this. But that one's a little bit more. Dance the Night Away is a little bit, I won't say dance music, but it's more upbeat, right?
Yeah, definitely.
It's a different vibe. So they're not just giving you the same thing over and over again. There's no songs that are as ferociously heavy as something like Running with the Devil or Ain't Talking About Love, I think, on this one. Can you think of anything that's as heavy as those? Maybe DOA has its elements that are heavy. I'm trying to think, though. Does anything else? I mean, maybe Light Up the Sky, but in a different way.
It's kind of got a different sound, that track.
It's got the finger tapping by
Yeah.
Eddie's all over that one. It's like a real finger tappy song. So that one's in there. I never have been able to tell what Women in Love is about. Can you? Like, it's...
No, I don't know.
Yeah. It's just... Is it about two women in love? Or is it like about David Lee Roth being in love with women? Or talk? I don't know. It's kind of like... Yeah. So that one always makes me laugh because I'm like, lyrically, I can't figure out what that one's about. But yeah, I mean, this one gets a strong recommendation again. I think the thing that hurt this album most is they called it Van Halen 2. So it didn't stand out from Van Halen 1 as much. If they'd called this that Daddy Longlegs, maybe it has a different vibe. But and yeah, they certainly go in a different direction on Women and Children First and Fair Warning after this one, while still maintaining a lot of what Van Halen is.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is still the most muscular, versatile version of the classic Van Halen sound, with like big Eddie riffs, Michael Anthony doing the equivalent of keeping the time on bass, but also helping to flesh out David Lee Roth's limitations as like a singer, right? But David Lee Roth, what he may lack as a traditional singer, which I think gets overstated sometimes too. Like people act like he can't sing. Like he can sing. He's just not a vocal powerhouse. But he adds with pure showmanship and just
Right.
pacing and timing and he has elements that make the vocal part very appealing. And then Alex Van Halen's a really excellent drummer, but he's not show off. Maybe like Hot for Teacher later, there's elements to stand out, but he's the classically trained musician that you think he is. He just plays in support of giving us a rock solid rhythm section. So yeah, this one gets a strong recommendation. It gets tough when we try to compare which one we'd pick between Van Halen 2 and Destroyer, because if it's just like what album do I like better, I would listen to Van Halen 2 more often than I'd listen to Destroyer for me. I think you'd probably say the same thing, right?
Yeah.
But in terms of influence, it's Van Halen 1, which is the influential album, and this is just the continuation of it, right? Whereas Destroyer is probably the more influential album in terms of listeners. So it kind of comes down to how much better an album is Van Halen 2 than Destroyer. And it closes the gap a little bit, but I still think the enjoyability and replayability of Van Halen 2 slightly pushes it ahead of Destroyer for me personally.
Yeah, Van Halen 2 is the one I immediately gravitate towards in comparison to these two. And I don't have kind of the emotional or nostalgic connection to Kiss that some other people do. I'd be curious. I wonder what, being a kid during that time period and hearing, liking Kiss and then hearing Van Halen and what kind of
I'm sure you'd have both of these albums on your shelf. You have to, right? You'd have to have Destroyer, Love Gun, Van Halen 1, and Van Halen 2 because they were released from 76 to 78, right?
Yeah, but I wonder if hearing Van Halen for the first time, your just mind is blown, or if it really, could you go back to Kiss after hearing this?
Yeah, you could. I think your mind is blown by Van Halen 1 without a doubt. But I also think when Kiss becomes this over the top band, they become the biggest hard rock band for kids, or teenagers and young adolescents in the world, right?
Yeah.
So the equivalent would be that you could have listened to many people could have listened to Black Album Metallica and Pantera at the same time, right? One on the Uprise, one the bigger brand. Maybe that's a bit. You get what I'm saying, though. Even other genres, right? One is the
just different flavors of rock.
Yeah,
is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah, you might like one better than the other, but you're going to have them in your. I was going to say 6-disc changer, but there was no 6-disc changer at this point. So you'd be popping out the 8 tracks, right? At this time in the car. And I could absolutely see a scenario where somebody puts on Destroyer or Love Gun, that one goes out, and then they pop on Van Halen 1 or Van Halen 2 as the next album they pick.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I don't think you would have had to make a binary choice. I think it would have been in the same, because back then, if you were a fan of a type of music, you bought the albums of that.
Right. Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah.
And so if you liked mainstream rock and roll and you were in California or Indiana or Pennsylvania, right?
Yeah.
And you were going to go to 3 concerts a year, you probably, if you were a teenager, Van Halen and Kiss were going to be 2 of the ones you were going to go see.
Yeah, that's true. And there is some kind of overlap or similarity between kind of David Lee Roth's showmanship and theatricality with Kiss's with showmanship. I imagine
they're both they're putting on a show with just slightly different things, but it's big stadium shows, and it's also rock music played with pop sensibility.
Yep. Yeah. Good point. Yeah, I did misspeak earlier. I said Jump was on Van Halen 1. That's not the comparison I was trying to make. I was saying Dance the Night Away and a song like You Really Got Me or Ain't Talking About Love in terms of kind of that pop appeal. But
yeah, Dance the Night Away and You Really Got Me have some elements, but it's kind of Dance Dance the Night Away. There's a song like Dance the Night Away on. You see, Van Halen has certain things that reappear on most of their albums, if not all of them. Like there's a song that sounds a lot like Beautiful Girls on every Van Halen album, right? There's a song that sounds like You're No Good on every Van Halen album, and it's usually one of the covers. Like
Yeah.
You're No Good, they do like Where Have All the Good Times Gone, I think on like Diver Down, right? Which is a Kinks song that is played in a very similar style. I think You Really Got Me is played in a very similar style to how like You're No Good is, right? Like a slowed down, grittier version of a mainstream song. So something like Bottoms Up is like the upbeat party song that's on almost every Van Halen song, where it's like the guitar that Eddie plays, right? Like has that
Yes.
like kind of sound to it. So yeah, there's always a finger tapping Eddie song, right?
Yep.
So on this one we talked about Light Up the Sky, but then Atomic Punk, right, is a song that's like that on the first one, stuff like that. So yep.
Yeah.
Well, good stuff. And now we are in the 80s, and we go from French pop and mainstream American rock and roll to British synthetic rock as our third genre for the 80s. Go ahead and tell the listeners the two albums we're going to be covering here, Josh.
Yep. We've got Human League's Dare with an exclamation point from 1983. And we've got the Eurythmics Touch from 1980.